Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I just thought I'd make this video to ramble about some thoughts I've been having regarding Solo: A Star Wars Story and its boycott, and my opinion on the prequels versus the sequels. So, first I'd like to say, I think the boycott has done a good job. The Hollywood Reporter released an article on the 4th of June, saying that Solo was expected to make $400 million at the global box office, and stated that the film would probably lose more than $50 million. However, they did claim that some industry financing sources said that the figure could come in at $80 million or higher. According to Box Office Mojo, the film has made worldwide $341 million as of June the 18th. In other words, it hasn't reached the $400 million mark yet, and thus is set to lose Disney a lot of money, and Lucasfilm a lot of money. Obviously, in terms of what Disney is as a company, it's not a lot of money at all. Disney rakes in millions, hundreds upon hundreds of millions every year, with its ownership of so many brands and IPs. Nevertheless, this is an embarrassment for Lucasfilm, and especially an embarrassment for Kathleen Kennedy, who is now rumoured to be stepping down in September. Now, obviously, these are still rumours, but the fact that there are even rumours concerning Kathleen Kennedy stepping down in September shows us that the boycott has had some effect. However, I don't think we, the Star Wars fans, can claim complete responsibility for this. I reckon personally that casual audience goers also avoided the film because they didn't like The Last Jedi. And I agree with the point John Talk Star Wars made, where he said that the reveal that Lando Calrissian was a pansexual likely scared away many families from seeing the film and taking their children to view it. Of course, Lucasfilm and Disney have been trying to deflect attention from the fact that Solo is bombing at the cinemas, and likely will not make a profit. They have done this with the usual tactics, claiming that the Star Wars fandom is filled with toxic people and contemptible persons. Recently, Kelly Marie Tran quit Instagram, or at least deleted all her posts. This was seized upon by the media and by Lucasfilm employees to claim that the Star Wars fans had harassed her off the platform. There is, of course, no evidence for this. I have not seen a scrap of evidence that Kelly Marie Tran was chased off of Instagram because of continual harassment by Star Wars trolls or Star Wars fans. No evidence for this exists. We are supposed to hear and believe, and so many publications and media outlets have actually jumped on this story and haven't bothered to check the facts. After all, occasionally, the facts actually get in the way of the good story. Also, it must be noted that Kelly Marie Tran has not stated why she deleted her Instagram posts. Essentially, we actually have no idea why she did it. There are theories and speculations, but I haven't seen any hard proof either way. The fact that so many media outlets are pushing the story as if it were true is shocking. It speaks volumes about the standards of journalism in many of these media outlets. But try as they may to demonize the Star Wars fandom, the box office numbers do not lie. People either do not want to see Solo, or they do not want to give money to Lucasfilm because of what they did in The Last Jedi. And nothing that Lucasfilm can do will change the fact that they're not making a profit from the film. At this point, it will take a miracle for Solo: A Star Wars Story to make enough money to be considered a success. Now, considering that Kathleen Kennedy is probably going to step down from Lucasfilm in September, the question is, do we continue boycotting? Do we continue to boycott Episode 9? I have to say, in my personal opinion, we should. I think that Star Wars should serve as an example along with Marvel Comics. An example showing that if you disregard your fans, if you decide to place politics above stories, and you decide to destroy characters for the sake of either your political or philosophical agenda, then you will lose money and you will lose your fans. And I have to say that Episode 9 is probably not going to be a good film. It is, after all, being directed by J.J. Abrams, and I'm going to talk more about him and The Force Awakens a bit later. And because I've been thinking about it an awful lot recently, I'd like to talk about my opinion concerning the sequels and the prequels. As some of you will know from watching one of my previous older videos, I was initially a fan of The Force Awakens. But I have since clarified, and I shall do so here, that I am no longer a fan of it. And I do prefer the prequels to The Force Awakens. And I'm just going to explain why I have changed my mind, but also I'm going to talk about the strengths of The Force Awakens and its weaknesses, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of The Phantom Menace. Now, naturally, I might start talking about The Last Jedi and the other prequels, such as Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, but I am going to try mostly to focus on The Phantom Menace versus The Force Awakens. Now, initially, as I said, I enjoyed The Force Awakens. But after watching it about 4 times, I suddenly discovered that I didn't really like it anymore. And I found that I enjoyed The Phantom Menace more. And even Attack of the Clones more than The Force Awakens. I couldn't quite figure this out, because on the surface, at least, Force Awakens was a better film. And I'm going to explain what I think is the main difference between The Force Awakens and The Phantom Menace. It's a case of ideas versus execution. Broadly speaking, The Phantom Menace has a lot of good ideas which are executed poorly, while Force Awakens has a lot of old ideas, just rehashed ideas from mainly A New Hope, executed well. I'd like the viewer to think back to the scene in The Phantom Menace where Obi-Wan Kenobi and Qui-Gon Jinn first met Jar Jar Binks. The scene, when you ignore how cringe-worthy Jar Jar is incredibly dull. The way it is shot is not particularly interesting or dynamic. The most exciting part in the scene is where 2 droids come chasing Obi-Wan and get destroyed by Qui-Gon Jinn. But then it gets back to a dull, dreary pace. The acting is rather wooden. The delivery of the lines is robotic and almost devoid of emotion. The dialogue isn't particularly interesting, there isn't any particular conflict in the scene, and the only character emoting anything is Jar Jar. And Jar Jar is an insufferable simpleton, so this isn't actually a good thing. In my opinion, the scene seems to go on forever, despite the fact it is actually a relatively short scene. And it moves on fairly quickly, and the plot progresses as normal. Nevertheless, it is not a good scene. It is not very dynamic, and it is not engaging. Now, I'd like the viewer to think back to The Force Awakens, and the scene where Finn first meets BB-8 and Rey. Finn sees that Rey is in trouble, and goes to help her, but Rey is a Sue, so she doesn't need his help, obviously. And Finn feels a little embarrassed for going to try and help her. BB-8 is then taken out of the bag that he was put in, and then he sees Finn. He makes some aggravated beeps and bleeps. Rey takes a look at Finn, asks whether that's him. Finn looks behind him, a little confused, and then Rey starts to chase him. And immediately we're into a small little chase which lasts about 10 seconds, where Finn, running for his life, scared of the quarterstaff, which the girl is wielding, runs round it through a tent, gets hit in the face, lands on the ground. Then Rey starts to accuse him of stealing Poe's jacket. Finn acts really confused and doesn't understand what's going on. BB-8 decides to press matters home and electrocutes him. Finn gets irritated and tells him to stop. Again, Rey accuses him of stealing the jacket. Finn starts saying that he's had a really bad day, and then gets electrocuted again. And then, Rey accuses him of stealing the jacket from BB-8's master. Finn then relaxes a bit, asks whether BB-8's master was called Poe Dameron, and then says that he tried to escape with him, and he died. BB-8 acts all sad, and rolls off, presumably to grieve. Then Rey helps Finn up, and asks whether he's with the Resistance. The scene is definitely not shot in a boring manner. The camera moves with the characters, it switches shots of different characters, and something interesting is happening in each shot, whether it be Finn running away, BB-8 electrocuting him, or Rey beating up a couple of thugs. Ultimately, the scene is dynamic. Now, that is a good argument to suggest that perhaps John Boyega is overacting in that scene in some sections, and I can see an argument that the scene was perhaps too comical and didn't take itself seriously enough. Those are arguments that I can be persuaded by, but the one thing you will never be able to persuade me about is that this scene was not dynamic. This scene was dynamic, it was interesting to view, and certainly it's very easy to remember as a result of it. Stuff happens in it, it's an interesting scene to watch. I think this is a perfect example. In comparison to the Phantom Menace's scene where we have Jar Jar, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan talking, which is just boring and dull, this one by comparison is fun and engaging. Let us go on to ideas. I want to look at the first scene in both The Force Awakens and The Phantom Menace. In The Phantom Menace, we get an opening title crawl which mentions the Trade Federation, a new faction, an entirely new faction, which hasn't been mentioned before. The conflict is a rather unusual one for a Star Wars film. Mentioned in it is a debate over the taxation of trade routes, and the Trade Federation has, in protest, blockaded Naboo, an entire planet, to make a point about the situation while the bill is being debated in the Senate. It then mentions that the Chancellor is sending 2 Jedi Knights to try and find a peaceful solution to the problem. We then see a ship flying through space, and then we see the captain of the ship communicating with the Viceroy of the Trade Federation. And we see that the Viceroy is a new alien, an alien we have not seen in Star Wars yet. Then we see the ship approach the Trade Federation ships. And the Trade Federation ships are a completely new design. These spaceships have not been seen in Star Wars before. Their design doesn't really replicate anything that we've seen in Star Wars before either, that design being half a ring with a sphere in the middle. The ship then lands in the landing bay, and we see for the first time battle droids and vulture droids. And this is actually an interesting point. Before The Phantom Menace, there was no concept of a battle droid in the Star Wars films. We had an assassin droid, which was one of the bounty hunters that Darth Vader was talking to in The Empire Strikes Back. But that was an assassin droid, or a bounty hunter droid, rather than a battle droid. The droids we see in the first scene of The Phantom Menace are battle droids. And might I just say, I really like the design of the battle droids. It's clear that the designer of these battle droids had taken some inspiration from skeletons of birds. And I have to admit, I really do like that decision. And then we see depicted the first female droid in Star Wars, TC-14. So L337 can get lost. TC-14 is the original female droid in Star Wars, and no matter what Lucasfilm's PR department say, L337 is not the first female droid in the Star Wars films. So already, in the first few minutes of The Phantom Menace, we've seen new designs of ships, new aliens, a new concept, that being the concept of battle droids and using them in battle, and we have a completely new and original conflict, one which is over politics and taxation rather than a simple good versus evil. The Phantom Menace, of course, does turn into a good versus evil story, which is not a bad thing, but at the beginning there is some ambiguity, and it is about a political situation and an economic one, or at least that's how it first appears on the surface. Let us now examine the opening to The Force Awakens. The title credits reveal that the First Order has arisen from the remnant and the ashes of the Empire, and is being led by a mysterious person called Snoke, and is more or less at war with the Republic by engaging with the Republic's proxy, the Resistance. We are told that Luke is missing and the First Order is after him. Then the title credits end, and we see a ship in the sky, and we later see that it is a Star Destroyer. A modified Star Destroyer, but nevertheless recognizable as a Star Destroyer. We then see some shuttles heading towards the planet, and we see inside these shuttles stormtroopers. The helmets are modified and the suits are slightly different, but nevertheless these are recognizable as stormtroopers. Then we see the planet. Then we see BB-8, a new model of droid which we haven't seen before in the Star Wars films, go off to tell Poe Dameron that the First Order is coming. The stormtroopers then land and start massacring the villagers. Poe Dameron then runs to his X-Wing to leave the planet. It is recognizably an X-Wing. Despite the fact that it is modified and it has a slightly different design to that of the original X-Wing, and presumably has updated weapons, it is nevertheless an X-Wing. Poe Dameron jumps inside, and his ship gets damaged before he can turn on the shields. He then gives the plans to Luke Skywalker, to BB-8, and tells him to run across the desert, while he, for some reason, stays behind to try shooting at stormtroopers. Then Kylo Ren comes out of the transport wearing a mask and outfit, which are similar to the ones shown in the Old Republic games. He then kills the village elder with his lightsaber, shows off a new force power and stops a blast in midair, and tells a giant woman wearing a crone stormtrooper outfit with a cape to massacre the villagers. By watching this, you can tell that nothing really has been added to the Star Wars universe. These ideas are not fresh. It ultimately still is a battle between Imperials and Rebels. The looks and the aesthetics of both sides have been changed slightly, and I'll emphasize slightly here, but ultimately it is a battle between Rebels and Imperials. Nothing new has been added, you've seen this idea before, it is not interesting. So broadly speaking, The Phantom Menace is filled with new ideas, while The Force Awakens is not. And broadly speaking, The Force Awakens executes its ideas rather well, while The Phantom Menace does not. For instance, consider the Galactic Republic. For the first time you see this political organisation, this political state really. You see the workings of the political state, which is known as the Galactic Republic. And the idea of the scenes concerning it are simple. The Chancellor's weak, he isn't willing to take action over the cause of Naboo. Queen Amidala needs help for Naboo. Palpatine, the senator for her planet, suggests that they try to get rid of him, so that somebody else can take charge. And later it is revealed that Palpatine wanted this to happen so that he could become Chancellor. In other words, he instigated a crisis to ensure that he would become the Chancellor. These ideas are really good, but the execution is terrible. I'm still not entirely sure how any of this really works. Why is it that Queen Amidala actually has the ability to call a vote of no confidence? Can any senator do it? If that was the case, why didn't someone do it earlier? Everyone seems happy that a vote of no confidence is called, so why didn't they do it themselves? If the Chancellor was so weak, wouldn't he have a number of political enemies circling him? Can anyone call a vote of no confidence at any time? How does it work? These things aren't explained particularly well. You basically understand them, but if you want further elaboration, it's really difficult to understand. Also, it's a little confusing as to what powers the Supreme Chancellor actually has. Does he actually have the ability to raise an army or not? It's confusing. None of it is really stated. You have to fill the gaps in with your imagination. An example of an idea which isn't particularly great, but of the execution being done well, is the attack on Starkiller Base in The Force Awakens. Having another super weapon which can destroy planets is admittedly dull. We've already seen it 2 times in Star Wars, but the attack is admittedly well filmed. The operation is interesting to watch, and the fighting is more or less done competently. To be honest, if I did a military analysis of The Force Awakens, there wouldn't be too much to criticise. Most of it is done well enough. Also, the scene where Starkiller Base destroys the New Republic is actually very well filmed. I know J.J. Abrams gets a lot of flack for using lens flares, and admittedly, in both the Star Trek films he directed, it was a meme. However, the use of lens flares in the scene where Starkiller Base destroys the New Republic shows that he learnt his lesson, because I think that was actually an effective use of lens flares. And the way that the music and the sounds, they sort of dim and quiet and take a low tone, actually really does emphasize that this is a truly horrific and horrifying event. And when Finn can see it from the ground on another planet, yes, it is a little ridiculous that he can see an explosion about a couple of systems away. That might be ridiculous, but nevertheless the execution of it is well done in the sense of we understand that everyone is dismayed, horrified, and shocked that the New Republic has been destroyed, and the fact that they can see it from another planet, regardless of how ridiculous it is, considering that the planet's in another system, does reinforce the message that this is a galaxy-changing event, that this event will have repercussions and consequences for the rest of the galaxy, and everyone knows it. It is admittedly very good execution, even if the basic premise is, one, dull, because we've already seen this before in Star Wars, and second, because it's slightly ridiculous. Nevertheless, the execution is well done enough. And I think this is why there was a great response to The Force Awakens, because the ideas of the prequels, specifically The Phantom Menace in this case, were ideas you had to access by rewatching. It's pretty hard to focus on the sort of core of the story of The Phantom Menace, which is admittedly quite good. It's difficult to focus on that when you have wooden acting, dull camera work, and terrible lines to get through. It really is tricky to get to the core of the story and sort of focus on the ideas of the storyline. With The Force Awakens, the presentation was good. What was being presented was same old, but the presentation was half the appeal. But on rewatching it, there's nothing more to appreciate. I can rewatch The Phantom Menace and appreciate that George Lucas actually sat back and did think about why everything was happening. And The Phantom Menace is actually really good setup for the rest of the prequel trilogy. I mean, J.J. Abrams didn't really set much up. J.J. Abrams left what he described as mystery boxes for writers such as Rian Johnson to either take on and unbox, or ignore completely and just make rubbish. But The Phantom Menace is a different story. We have the setup with Palpatine becoming Chancellor so that he could become Emperor later on in the prequels. We have Obi-Wan meet Anakin and set up to be his trainer and master for the rest of the prequels. We have Anakin meet Padme for the first time, and from there they have an established relationship where they will become husband and wife. But again, broadly speaking, The Phantom Menace has a lot of good ideas and a lot of good setup for the rest of the prequels, while The Force Awakens has no setups and very few good ideas. Nevertheless, The Force Awakens keeps an upbeat pace and manages to make the film fun enough that you forget the fact that you're seeing A New Hope rehashed, and A New Hope rehashed in a very cynical way. Now, I have to admit that this I can't really qualify. This is something I can't exactly examine and derive from a scene. Well, actually, I suppose it's not true. I can point to the fact that The Force Awakens rehashes ideas from A New Hope as evidence and a staple of cynicism. Nevertheless, The Force Awakens feels particularly cynical, in that we're sort of, let's reboot this so that we can make money way. I do not feel that way at all when watching The Phantom Menace. Watching The Phantom Menace, I never get the impression that George Lucas was making the film out of a cynical attempt to make money. I do believe that George Lucas actually was passionate for The Phantom Menace. I believe that a lot of love and care went into the creation of the film. And I am happy that there are so many good ideas in The Phantom Menace. And this is where I have to say why I prefer The Phantom Menace over The Force Awakens. I mentioned that I have watched The Force Awakens about 5 or 6 times now, twice in the cinema. With every reviewing of The Force Awakens, I just realised how shallow its ideas actually are. Or, to be fair, the ideas themselves are not shallow, but the ideas aren't new to the universe. They are the same ideas of A New Hope. And this is why the claim that The Force Awakens is bringing Star Wars to a new generation is completely absurd. If it was truly bringing Star Wars to a new generation, surely it would be telling a new story which would resonate with that generation. Instead, it's telling a story which resonated with the generation which grew up in the 80s. So, to claim that taking an old story is somehow taking Star Wars to a new generation is an argument I don't actually buy. And of course, it is just acting as an excuse for why the writers could not be bothered to come up with new material. But the reason I like The Phantom Menace more than The Force Awakens is because after rewatching The Phantom Menace, I can appreciate the ideas. The ideas, in my view, were not executed well. I think that if George Lucas had had another person direct The Phantom Menace, or had somebody who was willing to stand up to him, unlike the useless producer he ended up having, who was more or less a sycophant, then I think that the film could have been very good. In fact, looking at The Phantom Menace, and looking at the ideas contained within it, I think that the film could have been very good if somebody else had helped George make it. I won't say that The Phantom Menace is a good film, but what I will say is The Phantom Menace has a lot of good in it. And this I can respect and appreciate. The Force Awakens, with its rehashed ideas from A New Hope, and its cynical exploitation of Star Wars iconography, and its inability to bring forward new designs, concepts, and ideas to the world of Star Wars, just doesn't have a lot going for it. Simply put, it's easy to imagine somebody making The Phantom Menace a good film, but I find it difficult to imagine anyone making The Force Awakens a good film unless they completely reworked the script. And I mean completely, starting from scratch, because the ideas contained within just do not lend themselves to a new story. They lend themselves to an old story, a story we all have seen before. A story which does not add anything new to the universe of Star Wars, and will likely be forgotten. In truth, The Force Awakens isn't going to have the same legacy of the prequels. Love or hate the prequels actually had ideas and concepts which actually enriched the universe of Star Wars. The prequels will live on and will be remembered for this. The Force Awakens, which has not brought anything new to the table, or anything exciting to the table, will be forgotten. Already, not many people talk about it. Force Awakens is hardly mentioned anymore. The prequels never cease to be mentioned. So simply put, I prefer The Phantom Menace to The Force Awakens because of the fact that The Phantom Menace brings new ideas to the table and enriches the universe of Star Wars. Despite the fact I think the acting is terrible, and that the execution of its ideas was poor, it nevertheless contains gems you can find if you re-watch it. The Force Awakens is a shallow experience. The Phantom Menace actually has some depth to it. The surface level of The Phantom Menace is rather off-putting, especially Jar Jar Binks. However, it does have depth, which can be enjoyed, and I find that it does stimulate the mind a little. While The Force Awakens on the surface has a glossy shine to it, if of course we exclude Rey Sue, below the surface, it's rather shallow. If I had to use one word to describe The Phantom Menace, it would be flawed. If I had to use one word to describe The Force Awakens, I would use shallow. Simply put, I find myself enjoying The Phantom Menace when I rewatch it, but every time I rewatch The Force Awakens, I just wonder to myself, why am I not watching A New Hope, which does all of this far, far better? I hope you all enjoyed listening to this rather waffly ramble, and I hope you all have an excellent day. I would like to thank PVT-Skiggles and LulzyRobot for doing my portrait, which you can see on the screen. PVT did a brilliant outline for the image, and LulzyRobot is to be accredited for the rich colours and the deft final touches. Truly, my excellence has been captured. Both of these individuals have DeviantArt accounts, and I shall link them in the description for anyone interested in seeing the rest of their work. I should also mention another thing, which the Star Wars prequels have over the Star Wars sequels, and that is the memes. The prequels have attributed a vast quantity of high-quality memes to the internet, and for this we can thank George Lucas and many excellent meme artists. This is one of my favourite memes from The Phantom Menace.